I first of all would really want to express my gratitude for having been invited to contribute to this conference. It's just a wonderful experience to be here, to also enjoy the hospitality of Thailand. It's wonderful, Professor Sayamwala, to meet you again. You've been a long-time colleague and indeed friend. We haven't met for quite some time, and I find it wonderful to have the opportunity of talking to you and to see how fresh your mind has remained and how original your thinking is. But I would also want to express my gratitude in particular to Keokam, who is extending such a most wonderful and warm hospitality. I don't think I've ever been treated so well at any of the many conferences I've been to in my life as here. Thank you, Keokam. Now, when dealing with the link between food security and price developments, I want to focus mainly on food commodity, on agricultural commodity prices, and mention other commodities only in passing. And the theme of the discussion today is really this link between food security and declining prices, declining commodity prices. And indeed, food commodity prices have been declining after that exciting, if not frightening, period of price explosions that we've had in 2007-8, and as far as cereal prices are concerned, again, 10, 11, 12. And it appears a bit like in recent months, in 2014, the decline these prices has even accelerated. I've taken the liberty here to just copy that particular graph from the FAO website, which appears to indicate they're falling down, possibly even below zero. You may want, though, to take a look at the vertical axis, which doesn't go all the way to zero and therefore exaggerates the proportionality of that price decline a bit. But still, prices are possibly in free fall. Are they really? That's one of the issues that I want to discuss with you. After having taken a look at these price developments, I will then want to deal briefly with the question of what the implications might be for food security of such price developments, and say a few words finally about how policies should perhaps respond. All this will necessarily have to be a bit selective, if not eclectic, given the short period of time that I have for this presentation. Now, against that view that prices are declining and possibly declining without any floor, when we look at a slightly longer time horizon, we can see that even though food prices are on the decline, they are still higher than they used to be before the period where that price explosion took place. Even if you correct for inflation, as has happened with the lines that you see here, prices are still higher than what they've been in the past. Now I want to take an even longer time period into consideration, using the example of the international price for wheat in real terms, inflation corrected, which, as we've been reminded yesterday by Peter, have had this enormous peak in the first half of the 70s, some of us, including Amar, Peter, and myself, well remember that time and all the excitement and the huge emphasis that was given to improving the world food situation at that time. I'll have to come back to that a little later. But after that peak in 74-5, prices have calmed down again and continued along their secular decline in real terms. I would argue that the price explosion that we've seen more recently now, 2007-8, is of different nature, because it appears that even though we notice this decline now, prices may not really return to the lower levels that they had before 2007-8. Of course, this is a statement about what might happen in the future, and nobody knows what's really going to happen in the future, but there are people in this world who deal with price projections. One of the institutions doing so is the OECD, and that's the price projection produced by OECD for wheat. You'll forgive me for using OECD projections. After all, I've been responsible for doing these things for a number of years when I was Director for Trade and Agriculture in the OECD. And at the time, I also then developed a close cooperation with FAO on these matters, so that by bringing in information from developing countries, we've even improved, I believe, on the quality of these price projections. And of course, even though it's the OECD, and even though Stefan Tangermann at some time was their director for trade and agriculture, the OECD may have got it wrong, even though it worked together with FAO. But what that projection suggests to me is that prices for wheat, and I'll come to a few other commodities in a minute, may not really decline again to the level that they've had before. As a matter of fact, when you run simple regressions, log of price developments against time for that period before the price peak in 2007-8, you get that trend. And if you then run another regression for the more recent time period, including the projected development for the coming 10 years, you get that second trend. And what that appears to suggest to me is that we've moved to a higher plateau of prices. And even though from that higher level they may still decline somewhat in real terms, it is a higher plateau that the world has reached. Now, this is wheat. That's what the price development has been for rice, and the price projections of OECD and FAO for rice. And for rice, the projection, it's the most recent one of 2015 this year, even appears to indicate a slight increase in real terms. Now, the broader picture across a larger set of agricultural commodities appears to indicate that for the 10-year period ahead, 2015 to 2024, excuse me, this should be 2024, the average of the expected price for 2015 to 2024 relative to the longer term average, the years 92 to 2006, so before the price explosion. Nearly all commodities, all ag commodities are expected to be at a higher price level in real terms. And if you take the period immediately before the price boom of 2007 as the base relative to that period, and those are the blue bars, prices are expected for most ag commodities to be in real terms something like 20–30% above the level that we knew before the price boom has occurred. Now, why is that? What are the major factors behind these projections? And I would need several hours now to try and explain that. Let me mention only 3 points. One, as Professor Simweller suggested already, agriculture is closely linked to energy, and higher oil prices, which we do not have at this moment, but may have again at some point, drive up production costs, transportation cost, and all the rest of it, of this relatively energy-intensive sector, and that is certainly one of the factors behind. But there are two more specific agricultural elements in this. One is the fact that a rapidly increasing share of global output of agricultural commodities is now being used to produce biofuels. Look in particular at coarse grains and vegetable oils, and something in the order of magnitude of 12–13% of world output of these two commodities is now taken away from the food market and channeled into a different market. Some of that is happening because of market developments, but the largest part of it, and OECD has analyzed that very carefully, is a result of government policies in the form of mandates, production subsidies, use subsidies, quotas, and all the rest of it. So it is largely policy driven, and it is a totally new development. Within a 10-year period, beginning around 2000, this large additional demand has entered markets for agricultural products and has certainly driven up prices, and it's expected to remain there, irrespective of what happens to commodity prices. And just think of the Paris meetings last week. Many governments are simply determined, for good or not so good reasons, to continue to promote the use of agricultural commodities for the production of biofuels. There is, though, also one other equally worrying factor behind higher prices, and it's the fact that, unfortunately, yield growth for major cereals and grains has declined. We've had a green revolution, but we are no longer having one. We may want to have one again, but it's not there. And if you combine the decline in yield growth worldwide with a growing growth rate of demand for food, in particular from emerging economies, China being one of them, then of course you wouldn't be surprised to find that there may well be reason to believe that we have reached a higher price plateau for agricultural commodities. Now that's the price picture, and as I said, my impression, take that as a sort of interim conclusion, is yes, prices are declining, but maybe we shouldn't exaggerate the importance of that decline, but also keep in mind that they may be declining from a very, very extremely high level, but not really to a level that's below what we have had in the past. They may actually even remain above that level. So depending on what your perspective is, if it's short term, just the last few years, then yes, they are declining. If you have a somewhat longer time horizon, then maybe it's not a decline, it's actually an increase in the plateau. Now, what are the implications of that for food security? And I discuss this in terms of high food prices because of that possible increase in the level. Of course, you can simply reverse the whole argument by replacing high by low or declining and just reversing the implications that I will be drawing. But as I said, I continue to argue that prices are probably higher than they've been in the past and will remain so. Now, high prices are certainly good for producers. They're a problem for food consumers, and how a country is affected, how individual households are affected, depends on, are they net producers or net consumers? Do they produce as much as they consume and possibly even more? Or do they need to buy food in order to maintain their consumption? Now, what is the case regarding that net trade status, that net buying or selling status? First of all, for those countries where food security is most of a problem, the least developed countries. Now, if you take them as a group and look at one of the most important staple food, cereals, then you can see that the least developed countries as a group are a large net importer of cereals at a relatively rapidly growing rate. They are net exporters in a negative sense. The green line is below the zero line, which says they are net importers. They are net importers not only of cereals, they are net importers of rice as a group. As a matter of fact, they are net importers for the whole group of agricultural products taken together, expressed not in weight, but obviously in monetary terms. Now that's the group, but if you look at individual countries and ask yourself which proportion of all developing countries is in the group of net food importing countries, then you can see the result shown by these bars here. For the first half of the 80s and for the second half of the 2000s, and you can see that a growing share of all countries in the respective groups are net food importers. That's particularly true for the low-income countries. Among the developing high-income countries, there are 100% of them net food importers. If you take all developing countries together, 80% of the, if I can call it, head count of developing countries are now net food importers, and the share is growing. That's the country level overall. Obviously, it doesn't apply to all individual countries. Thailand is a net exporter of cereals, rice, and even agricultural products overall. So yes, there are major exceptions, but for the group of developing countries overall, it remains true that they are net food importers, and therefore high food prices are a problem rather than a solution. That's not the case for Thailand. The food exporting country, of course, is happy to see high food prices. Now, when we move to the level of individual households, and I can present to you only a few selected individual countries, and then look at which share of households in individual groups is a net buyer or net seller. Then you can see that in most developing countries in the group that I've shown here, there is a good share of urban households that are net buyers. What not everybody appreciates, though, is that even among the rural households, you have a large share of net buying households, because their resource base doesn't allow them to produce as much food as the family needs, so they have to go out to the market. Peter shakes his head and doesn't simply believe the statistic.
Why aren't urban almost entirely net buyers? They don't produce very much.
I have asked myself that question as well. This is not just grain, it's food overall, and there are these urban gardening people and what have you. I was a little surprised to find that. I agree completely. So there are even a few rural net sellers, obviously, not even that. There are rural net sellers, but among the countries in that particular group here, that share is less even than the rural net buyers, with the exception of Vietnam. Now, what does all that mean? If food prices increase, how does it affect the welfare of these households? Here are 5 income quintiles, and to the left, the green bars shows the poorest people, and when you increase food prices by 20%, their welfare goes down in the order of magnitude of 4 to 6%. Among the countries included here, Vietnam being the only exception where a food price increase is welfare improving. Now, the interim conclusion from that is high food prices aren't really very good for developing countries. For at least most of them, they aren't good for most individual households in developing countries. How should policies respond to that? Domestic policies in developing countries wouldn't do a very good job if they were to aim at supporting food prices at a high level, because that produces more harm to consumers than benefit to farmers, simply because of that net buying position. The multilateral trade system, I believe, should not encourage price support policies. It should also discourage policies that enhance volatility on markets, both domestic and international markets. And the international community, when providing assistance, should do more to improve agricultural development and food security in developing countries. Let me make a very few selective comments on that, beginning with the issue of providing support to agriculture. The measure that the OECD uses to see how much support is provided by governments is what's called the producer support estimate. That expresses the share of total farm revenue that comes from government policies as opposed to markets. And you can see in the rich countries, the OECD member countries, this was at the level of around 35% in the mid-90s and has declined to about 20% more recently. If you set against that a group of emerging economies, and unfortunately I'm not in a position to show you such numbers for all developing countries simply because those statistics don't really exist in that form. So you simply have to bear with me when I talk about a selected group of emerging economies. You can see that the level of support that they are providing to their agriculture has increased quite a bit in recent years, and a good part of that indeed is price support. Overall, for the total group, there was a slight decline. What I find somewhat worrying really is the fact that this means that if you take that whole group together, and for a moment, let me just claim this is the world, even though, of course, it's not, because it's only a number of emerging economies that are included. The share of global farm support, what governments do to support agriculture, that is provided in emerging economies has increased significantly over the last roughly 10 years. So I'm not sure that domestic policies in those emerging economies included here, and for that matter in a number of other developing countries, are really considering whether such support policies are providing the right incentives and benefits to their economies. Now, a very eclectic comment on the WTO. And of course, as all of you know, at this very moment, ministers are meeting in Nairobi to discuss these matters, and it doesn't really look very promising what the media reports have to say about the situation in Nairobi. One of the issues there, and it's very much pushed by a group of developing countries known as the G33, with India being particularly interested in this issue, is should developing countries not be allowed to provide price support to those domestic producers from which they buy staple food, to put that into storage for food security reasons, without that being constrained by WTO rules on domestic support, because India has run into problems with that. And I must say that I'm not at all convinced that that is a good option. Storage policies may be very, very helpful, but it's not necessary to provide price support to domestic producers when you want to stockpile food in order to be prepared for an emergency situation. You can simply buy it at market prices. And I would go as far as saying not only you can, but you should do it that way. Why? Because producer price support is far less efficient than improving the enabling environment for agriculture. Things such as extension, education, infrastructure, research, technology development. So it's not a matter of should you or should you not provide support to agricultural development. It's a matter of the right way of doing so. Let me also, more in passing, suggest that in the WTO there should be more talk about disciplining export restrictions, because in my mind, the fact that a number of countries have embargoed exports in the 2007-8 period has very much contributed to creating panic and therefore driving up prices. Finally, as far as policies are concerned, more needs to be done to support agricultural development and food security in developing countries. This is the share of total official development assistance that's being channeled into agriculture. And you can see that that has increased a lot after the world food crisis in the mid-1970s, because everybody got so convinced that the world needed to do more in order to make the world more food secure. But then as prices calmed down, people simply forgot about it again, and it fell back to the same low levels it had before. You can see a bit of an increase more recently now in response to the price crisis that we've had in 2007-8 and following years, but it's minimal really, and it's beginning to fade away again. And I think that is a very, very sad story. This time, the words of policymakers, when the G8, the G20 get together to talk about these matters, are great. The deeds are far less convincing. What could be done? I have one suggestion, which is somewhat original. We've discussed that in the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, and people liked it there, is that a new instrument maybe can and should be created at the international level, establishing some sort of a link between what farmers in the better off countries, what governments in the better off countries do for their farmers, and what the international community can do for agricultural development in the poorer countries. And that suggestion is that you simply measure the level of support provided to farmers in the industrialized and emerging countries, in the better off countries. Take any measure, for example, the one that's being discussed in the WTO, the overall trade distorting support, and say, in proportion to what we do, measured that way for our farmers, we also do something for agriculture in developing countries. And just to give you an idea of possible orders of magnitude, if you take just 1% of what governments do for farmers in the rich countries and channel that into agricultural development in the poorer countries, that would increase current official development assistance to agriculture by 20%. So I think that is a real element of financial solidarity. If that could be introduced, the funds would then be used to improve food security and agricultural development in countries meeting agreed quantifiable criteria. The conclusions from that is the new normal in markets may or may not be a higher level of prices. I think there is some probability that it may be higher, but there's no certainty, of course. I wouldn't claim I know what is going to happen to markets in the years to come. If I knew, I probably wouldn't be standing here, but cashing in on that knowledge by being active in markets. So since there is that uncertainty, the trade regime should be prepared for both high and low food prices. And that's not really the case in the WTO. In the past, it focused on depressed prices and was trying to discipline policies who contributed to price depression. To be on the safe side, the WTO should also do more to guard against high food prices. And I've mentioned a couple of things that maybe should be done for that. And in any case, the international community should certainly do more to improve food security in developing countries and perhaps establish some sort of link between all the benefits they provide to their domestic farmers and what they do for agricultural development and food security in the poorer countries. Thank you very much.